Hello class. For this week's video, I wanted to give you some advice on drawing faces. For your exercise this week, you're going to block out 4 sections on your paper to draw life-size your features. So you should be drawing an ear, a mouth and chin, nose, and eyes. So you should draw an appropriate sized boundary for yourself or use painter's tape. And I wanted to give you some guidelines on what type of lighting to set for this exercise, since you will be using yourself. I suppose you could do this with somebody around you if they're willing to pose. It doesn't necessarily need to be your own face, but this is the lighting that I'm requesting, and it's the same lighting that I asked you all to apply to your egg for the egg drawing, which is half light, half shadow, and reflected light. So you need to be able to see the detail and information in the shadowed area of the image. So the light source should actually be fairly close to your subject, to your face, to create this type of highlight. So the thing you're looking for is that there are clear areas of value that are different. So you've got a highlight section, mid-tone, and a darker shadow. And then you shouldn't blow out all the information in the shadowed side. So that's the guidelines for lighting for this exercise. And I set these guidelines so that way you can draw more convincingly the three-dimensional form. That shadows, as you come to understand, are one of the best ways to communicate form and space to a viewer. So now I'm going to go through a couple tips on drawing the features of the face. It's one of my favorite subjects to draw, and so I have quite a bit to say on the subject. Here I've mapped out 2 sections on my page to do an eye and the mouth and chin, but I'll talk about all the features I'm asking you to draw this week. So the graphite pencils will give you more control for this exercise. So I just have a 2B pencil, and first what I did is I just turned my 2B pencil on the side to lay a ground to start with. So I'm looking at my reference image of the eye. That's what I'll be working from. I am requesting that you all work from a mirror. I'm doing this from a photograph for the demonstration purposes. So as with any other graphite drawing, you want to begin with very light line work. I'm just roughly eyeballing where I see features of my face. If you're working from a mirror, you can actually hold your fingers up to your eye and then take that measurement over to your page and make 2 marks to communicate where the ends are, or draw 2 marks. So that's a really good way to get scale if you're working life size. And it's important that you don't dip below life size for this, because the smaller you draw your subjects, the less room you have for detail. So one of the most important tips I can give you about eyes is, this goes for all the features, you want to be communicating the spatial dimensions to your subject. And so restricting the white of the page is really important. It's why I set the ground. So that way it restricts the white of the page. So the first tip I'm going to give you all is that the white of the eye, you really want to question whether or not that is white at all in your view. So in my reference image, it is catching light, and the white of the eye tends to catch highlight closest to the iris, the colored part of the eye. Because it's a sphere that protrudes, so light will oftentimes catch. You can see light's catching on the lid too, and light oftentimes catches on the brow ridge where the skull actually protrudes, and light will catch above the eyebrow. So you can look out for that. Oftentimes I'll notice light will catch on the lower lid, and so that's important to communicate the form there. You should usually be able to see a tear duct, and light will sometimes catch there. And you know, the shadow that gets cast by the upper lid you can draw it as a line, and that will oftentimes communicate the eyelashes. One of the biggest mistakes people make is they really pronounce eyelashes. Some people have very large eyelashes or long eyelashes. You can see mine get hidden in the shadow that the upper lid is casting, so oftentimes I just have to place the shadow and it'll stand in for eyelashes, and I don't even need to paint them at all. So the next thing that I'm doing with my rendering of the eyes, I'm just pushing some of the values to where they are. The white of my eye on the right is darker than on the left, so I'll draw that in. The shadows on my skin are darker than what I'm seeing in my drawing, and then I'm just going to take a Q-tip to blend. Some of you are not blending enough, and so you're just leaving the texture that the graphite naturally leaves, and that texture is only effective in rendering certain subjects. So you should all, especially when you're rendering skin, you're going to need to work on the texture. So now it's blended into the page a little bit. Now I'm gonna hit it with the eraser. This is why I like setting a ground also. It lets me erase out for highlights. I'm just gonna take the opportunity to adjust the contour. I'm looking at what the triangle shape is that the white of my eye is making over here. Sometimes when you're working with graphite, you have to erase a larger area than what needs to be lightened, just because the eraser is a certain size. So for the glimmer in my eye, there's 2 glimmers. I actually had to erase out a large swath, and I'm just going to re-darken everything but where I want the small point of light. So I'll place the second one up here, that's fine. So now I'm going to get the shadow from my upper lid. This shadow is being cast on the white of the eye right here. So just because it's called the white of the eye doesn't mean it should be the white of the page or that it's all white. The white of the eye tends to get a little shadow closer to the edges because it's a sphere that's pushing back in space. So now I'm going to erase up. You really have to understand the form of what you're drawing in order to communicate convincing form. And so I've learned a lot about what's actually happening spatially on a face from painting and drawing faces so much. So I'm just erasing a couple of those highlighted areas. If you're working from life, there might be minor adjustments or changes as the angle of your head moves, and that's okay. But as you can see, since I'm working from a photograph for this video, I'm losing some information that I'd be able to see if I were looking in a mirror, especially in iris, the color part of my eye is so dark. So these highlights I erased out, they're helping communicate different forms to the plane of my face. Just come up. And you should be comparing the lightness or darkness of your different parts of your face because the values are all relative. Well, I'm going to erase out a larger moment than I need to for this tear duct that's catching light and glimmer because it's wet. carve out the lightest part of the white of my eye. Some of you might have what's called a limbal ring, which is that the color part of the eye, the iris that I'm shading right now, is darker at the edges before it hits the white of the eye. That's called the limbal ring. So look out for that. Oftentimes light will catch within the iris, the colored part of the eye. And so even though my eye is really sort of dark in this image, you can still see that there's a little bit of light catching, so I'm just gonna denote that in the drawing. So there's a little bit of light catching in the eye. Make sure that you're always just drawing what you're seeing. I've mentioned before that we live in a linguistic culture, and so that understanding of only thinking about the nameable parts of, say, the face, that needs to be mindfully kind of fought against when you're trying to see things for what they are. So make sure you're not drawing eyelashes that really aren't there. Make sure that you're not drawing the white of the eye as the entire thing is blindingly white if it's not. And the last thing I'll do on this little eye rendering is I'm going to show you what I do for eyebrows. So I already mentioned light catches on the brow ridge. The thing with hair, eyebrows or head hair, is you need to communicate that they are made up of individual hairs, but also they're seen as a solid mass. When you look at somebody's eyebrow, it looks like a single eyebrow as well as multiple hairs, and so that's the effect you need to give off. And I will just cluster marks. I'm looking generally with where the hairs are accumulating, what the direction of them are, where do they start, and I'm varying the pressure now, applying a little bit more pressure. I'm just checking the distance from my eye to my eyebrow to make sure that was good, so it needs to come down a little bit. And then over here, it's actually a bit of shadow and the eyebrow darkening this area. So set yourself up for a good drawing here by making sure you have plenty of shadows. Remember, that's one of the most important things. Okay, so that's fine for my eye rendering. As a demo, this is just what I would do. All of you have your own ways of navigating through a drawing. I want you attempting realism for these, and remember not to go below life size or else. It's not really possible to cultivate this level of detail. There's a reason why I never really go below life size at a painting, and that's because I don't like sacrificing the detail. Alright, so that's far enough for that one. I'm not going to demo the nose, but I'll just give you a couple tips. The sharp edge of the nostril shadows should be paid attention to and replicated in a drawing. If you have light diffusing or shadows diffusing from under the nostril, make sure that you're communicating that. Make sure that you're setting up your image so that way the nostrils are visible and it's clear what the form is. If it's not clear, move your lamp until you can see your nostrils defined. You know, light catches oftentimes underneath the nose because the area of flesh above our mouth protrudes, so light will catch there. Matching a bright glimmer on the nose is oftentimes important, so just make sure you set up your light so that your nose has highlight, mid-tone, and shadow to work with. and make sure that you can see enough information in the shadowed area to be able to draw in the shadows. So there's just a couple things about noses. This part of the nose is always really important to get right. So I always compare how much lower is it sloping than the nostril shadow. Does it meet the bottom of the nostril? Okay, so there's just a couple things with noses. It's also really important that you don't carve out the nose, like outline it up here when there really is no outline. The planes of the nose become pretty ambiguous when you're not looking at the tip, and so you should be drawing the subtle way the nose becomes the cheek. Alright, so I will demo the mouth, but the last thing I'm asking you to draw this week is the ear. And the trick for drawing ears is that you need to show that they have volume to them, that they're three-dimensional. The mistake is to draw ears as flat. So make sure you light your ear in a way that brings out the forms by giving you highlight, midtones, and shadows. So make sure that you are doing that. So shadow will oftentimes catch on the underside of the rounded earlobe. And so you can communicate that shadow climbing on the underside, and that will give you some volume to the ear. Similarly, the edge of the ear oftentimes will have a similar form, rounded. So just the trick is really setting up the light so that way you're emphasizing the form of the ear. That's important. Okay. The other last tip I'll give you about ears is sometimes your values will be fading on rounded curves such as here. Other times it's more abrupt where the shadows are sharper against a form overlapping over another. So make sure you're communicating those differences in the shadows, whether they're diffusing gently or really sharply. That's important for ears. And also you should understand the form, that this section of the ear is protruding in front of this. Make sure you understand what's going on. This part of my ear is protruding in front of this. This is pushing back. This is pushing forward in front of this. You have to understand the form of it, or else it'll be confusing to the viewer too. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to demo and talk to you about is drawing lips and chins. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about is measuring for what I call the face meat, which is not the technical term, but it's the non sort of feature part of the face, like this section of cheek. So you can always measure against the with a horizontal measurement to check against the mouth what that distance is. I like making that comparison. Also check my lip height to my chin, because depending on how the head is tilted, that distance will be different. All right, so I'm just gonna eyeball in about life-size scale the mouth. So the upper lip, which is what I'm drawing right now, oops, it's off center. So the upper lip, which I'm drawing right now, is oftentimes catches shadow because it's downturned, and so you can see my upper lip is in shadow compared to my lower lip, which is in highlight. It's really important when you're drawing mouths to look carefully at the crease of the mouth between the lips and the specific angle. Is it dipping down and coming up? Mine at this angle is slightly a V. I'm gonna roughly get lips in. My lower lip is about twice as thick as my upper lip. This is always a tricky area. It's the part of the face that protrudes with the lip but is not the same color as the lip. So that will oftentimes catch highlight because it's also protruding, but it's just not the same color as the lip. So in a grayscale drawing, you would communicate that with the darkness of the natural lip color. The reason why lips are red or pink oftentimes is the skin is thinner than on your face, and so that's why you see more blood and it's redder. So at the chin, it's really important that you communicate any shadows. The neck pushing back in space is oftentimes something I'm eager to communicate in a drawing, and just make sure that you're measuring angles, or else the planes of the face will be not convincing. Working from photographs of faces can be tricky because sometimes you're not able to tell the specific forms of what's going on. So that's why drawing from life has its advantages. But the advantage of drawing from a photo is your model's not moving. So the lip is actually made up of two, I think, muscle groups. So that's why there's this almost split at the center, and it's almost like two pillow-like forms that make up the lower lip. And oftentimes light will catch, and so those bright highlights you would want to denote. I'm just going to turn my pencil to the side to lay some shading down for the shadow of the side. Next, I'm going to get this chin shadow. Catching the crease of the mouth at the end is always important to get that subtle form. Okay, so then I will blend. Once you get to the drawing of the full face, make sure that you're measuring. So you would want to use the eye probably as a measuring unit to measure, to make sure, is it one eye width in between the eyes? Is it one eye height to the bottom of the nose, or is it 1.5? Is one eye width the same width as the mouth, or is it smaller? Just to remind you, something's only disproportionate compared to something else. So now I'm going to erase out a little bit for the lips and chin. My neck. Light will catch, as I mentioned before, above the lip, so I'm using the eraser to carve that out. Light's catching here in the divot above the mouth. As I was blending, I was careful not to touch the edge. Too much pressure. Okay, so now I've got some values in. I find that drawing the face is very much about understanding the physical form. So to get the realism to happen, it takes a lot of build-up, especially if you're going to be working in the graphite. It can take some time and repeat applications. That might be something, if you haven't tried it yet, to just keep going back in to carve out the form. There's a bit of reflected light catching at the underside of my upper lip here. I have to lay down more material to get these values to sit. They should. Okay, And now I'm just going to more tightly render. Check this. So everywhere on our face there's physical form and dimension and specific form and dimension, and so that's what I'm looking for. Every time you see my pencil moving, it's because I'm noticing something that's different. My drawing that my reference, mainly it just needs to get a lot darker. So the wiping and the blending and the repeat applications is also to eliminate that texture that happens by default in a drawing. Switching to a more sharpened pencil. Something that you can do because values work together and are relative is I'm going to press extremely hard now to concretize the crease of the mouth. And I've been mindful of the reflected light that sits on the underside of my upper lip. And so in order to make it feel like that's there, I need to go quite dark, I think, with the crease of the mouth. Yeah, and then that makes this now seem like the reflected light in comparison. So I can keep building up material and refining. Erase a little bit out for some texture there. I'm erasing in an angled stroke to help support the protrusion of the face there. Leave some brief. So this is how I would continue to work on and develop the mouth drawing. And okay, so I'll let you all get started. Make sure that you're going life size. I recommend that you work from life, so make sure that you set up good shadows and a good light source similar to the light in my sample image, and that can be found in the Drive folder.